Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to Unacademy, one-stop destination for English medium civil services aspirants. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we pick up the Delhi edition of today's The Hindu newspaper and analyze the important articles which have appeared both for the perspective of your prelims as well as for the mains examination. Now let us take a look at the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for. So in total today we are going to discuss around 9 different topics relevant for various different papers of your GS, from GS paper 1 to GS paper 3. All these various different articles, they talk about the issues which are in relevance. At the end of this discussion, we shall also take up 2 of the practice subjective type questions, where I urge you to write the answer on your own and try to get it evaluated, thereby march further forward in your preparation journey. Now, having said that, let us initiate the discussion with the first article of the day. And the first article which has appeared in the editorial section of the newspaper is a reform window. Now, what is this article about? So basically, this article highlights the uptick in the terms of the amount of GST revenue that have been collected, and it indicates a trend which is apparent for the past year, whereby the GST collections have been increasing quite significantly. Now, the GST revenue for the month of March, which basically reflects the transactions which have happened in the month of February, right? So the transactions which have happened for the month of February reflected in the March data have indicated that the GST collection is close to around rupees 1.78 lakh crores, which is in fact the second highest figure in terms of the GST revenue collected ever since the new regime was brought into place. Now, before this month, you had April of 2023, which indicated such a large increase. And the month of April generally indicates a higher amount of GST collection because of the fact that you have the pending GST bills which need to be get cleared and the tax realizations which end up happening at the end of the year. So that indicates an uptick in the month of April. For all practical purposes, the estimates they indicate that even for this particular month of March, the revenue could very well exceed the sum of 2 lakh crores, which is huge. If you think about the initial years after the GST was implemented, the amount of revenue generated would barely reach 1 lakh crore. And now when you have a consistent hitting of more than 1.6 lakh, 1.7 lakh crore figures, that bodes well for the economy going ahead into the future. And that is what this article talks about. It also highlights that, look, GST is an indirect tax. But even when we talk about the direct tax collections, they have also indicated a buoyant rise, a buoyant uptick in the amount or the total amount of direct tax which has been collected. Now, whenever you have this direct tax and indirect tax collection amount increasing, that increases the legroom which is available with the government in order to implement various different policy measures, in order to bring forward innovative social sector schemes, and in order to improve and increase the welfare net for the larger society. It also will give increased leeway for the government to invest in areas such as defense services, infrastructure building, and so on. Now, the GST collection which has been increasing, if you take a look at the data, now this is the data of PIB which indicates to you the GST collected in the financial years of 2022-23 and 23-24. The blue color, that indicates the FY 22-23. Whereas the yellow one represents the FY 23-24. So observe that as compared to last year, there has been a continuous rise in terms of GST collection month after month, and that too even if you consider on a comparative basis of year-on-year scale. There also the GST revenue has increased as indicated from the previous financial year. Even though the rate at which the GST revenue is rising the rate of rise of that revenue is close to around 11.6%. So that is the rate at which this GST collection is rising year after year. Now in 2022 and 23, this rate of rise was close to around 20%, but that has moderated to 11.6%, and that is largely accrued to the concept or the phenomena of the base effect. What is that phenomena of base effect? Very briefly. So, in the preceding financial year, and listen to this carefully, in the preceding financial year of 2021 and 22, the GST collections were significantly lower, partly owing to the post-COVID scenario, and the world was still opening up. So when the amount of revenue was lower in those years, the rate of increase which could be indicated was much more substantial. And hence 22-23 indicated almost a 21% rise. Almost 21% rise in the amount of GST which has been collected. But already in the year 22-23, you had a substantial sum of GST collections, so thereby the rise is still there, but the rise is only around 11%. So while the growth rate has moderated, the absolute values of growth have been significant. To simplify it in the simplest of the terminologies, think about it. If in one particular year, you are scoring 50 out of 100. Now next year, if you score, let's suppose 75, you would have increased your marks by close to around 50%. Right? But then after that, from 75, let's suppose you have increased your marks to around even 82, 83. That is a substantial increase. But then that rate of rise is only close to around 10%. So that is the concept of base effect. So it is because of that base effect where that growth number in the absolute percentage term does not seem to be monumental, but nonetheless it is a significant achievement. Now why has this increased? What are the reasons behind this increase in GST revenue, or should we simply celebrate the increased GST revenue and our work is done? So there are certain factors which are attributed to it. One factor is basically the tax agencies tightening the noose and plugging the various different gaps which were used for tax evasion earlier. So here you have, amongst the reasons for increase, two major reasons can be cited. The first reason is increased and better realization, tax realization. How? By plugging the loopholes of the fake invoices and other various mechanisms of tax evasion which have been put forward by the merchants ever since the new regime has come into place. The other reason of the increase in GST collection is increased amount of consumer spending. That indicates a larger economic activity which is going on, and which is always a good news for the economic sector at large, because that means the economy is going to expand. So that means also greater spending in the economy. Okay. Now these two things are basically highlighted by this increase. Now this article also tells us that, look, now that the GST revenues are consistently in the range of 20 lakh crores, that is the amount of money that we are going to realize this year. If the GST revenues are consistently in that range, now is the time when you have comfortable amount of money coming in, that is the time to bring forward some reforms. The long pending reforms. Reforms in economic policies should always be done ideally when the economy is doing good, so that the economy can withstand these severe shocks and the various different types of jolts. It should not be done, it should never be done when the economy is already doing bad. In that case, the impact will be much more exaggerated. That is why now that the GST collections have indicated such a sharp uptick, that is the ideal time to bring forward some amount of reforms. So before taking a look at the type of reforms which the article also advises and what should be brought into place, there are a couple of challenges which have also been indicated. For example, the GST collection from goods import, that has indicated close to around a 5% drop. In the month of February, the GST collection from goods import had indicated a rise by around 6 to 8%. Now that has dropped by 5%, which basically means that you have a lesser amount of spending on discretionary items. So the import bill is coming down. While reduction of import bill is always a good news, that okay, the deficit figures will be much more favorable now. But it also indicates the possibility that indeed some sectors of the economy are not doing that well. That is why people, they are basically curbing down on their discretionary spending which they would have spent otherwise, and that is why a reduced GST collection. So that is one of the challenge that we have to be vigilant of going ahead into the next month, that whether that trend is continuing or whether it is an aberration due to the global scenario and the wars which have broken out around the world. Now, coming to the need of reforms, what are the reforms which can be brought into the place? So, a long pending demand by the industry, by the consumers, and by the general various different state governments also has been the rationalizing of the GST structure in terms of the bands of the rates which are basically accrued upon various different items. For example, when we talk about the modern day scenario of fighting against climate change and global warming is one of the major concerns. Now, in that case, hybrid vehicles, they are a way out. And hybrid vehicles, their usage has to be promoted. Now, for these hybrid vehicles, the GST rate is at a whopping 40%. Now, if you have such a high amount of GST rate, now it is a different matter that this high GST rate is largely brought into place in order to protect the domestic industry. But nonetheless, if the tax rates are so very high, even the domestic production will never be able to meet the international level. And the domestically produced cars and vehicles, they will never be so very efficient in terms of cost of production that they can withstand the international competition. So one needs to rationalize these rates. And for example, even when we talk about services such as insurance and when we talk about cement industry, there also the GST rates need to be brought lower, so that financial inclusion as well as the concept of infrastructure building and the area of infrastructure building, that is also explored. Other than that, areas such as electricity and petroleum, which are not under the GST purview, they should be brought, and a larger consensus making exercise should be done. Just how the GST Council operates, they should bring the various different finance ministers of the different states on board and try to bring the petroleum and electricity sector within it, so that you can have a regularized price point for petroleum products across the entirety of the country, and that will benefit various transportation sectors, even sectors such as aviation, which is plagued by very heavy amount of taxes on the fuel, due to which the aviation sector is not growing. So there also regularization and bringing forward of GST rates, that can also be of significant help. Other than that, lowering the rates for greater compliance. And this is an accepted theory, that when the tax rates in general are higher, there is a greater probability and greater number of incidents of tax evasion, and black money gets generated. If the tax rates are lower, then there is a greater opportunity for compliance. There is a greater nudge for compliance. So more people will pay taxes. As a consequence, automatically the revenue kitty will keep on growing up. Then getting rid of GST compensation cess. Now, this has also been advocated in the article that when we talk about GST compensation cess, now this was an additional tax, a cess, which was basically charged in order to compensate for the amount of money given to the states during the time of the COVID pandemic. At that point of time, various different states were given money by the center and various different schemes were also run. So in order to realize that amount of money, that is where the compensation cess was charged. And this was kept by the center. Now, this has become a bone of contention between the center and the states. Now, over the past year, the amount of money which has been basically collected in the head of the compensation cess is close to around 1.44 lakh crore. Under this, the amount of money which has been collected is close to around rupees 1.44 lakh crores, which is significant and a huge amount. So always the temptation on the side of the government will be that let us continue this. There is some amount of money which is coming in. We can basically implement some or the other program welfare scheme from this. So the article says, and rightly so, that let us discontinue this unless and until you want to impose a cess on sin products such as, let's suppose, tobacco, etc. There you can impose this additional amount of tax, but it should not be imposed as a blanket mechanism across all the various different products. That will lower the tax rate and again improve the compliance structure. Okay, so this is the opportune moment for this kind of a reform initiative to be brought about. That is what the article tells you. So in this article, in a brief few seconds, what is it that we have discussed? The increased collection of GST revenue, and it is the second highest GST collection ever since the new regime has been brought into place, which tells you that the tax collection, the indirect tax collection is very buoyant. Now the reason for that is plugging the loopholes of tax evasion, and at the same time a better economic scenario and better economic performance is increasing the consumption. What are the challenges? A reduced GST realization from the goods import, that is one challenge. Now, if the revenue is increasing and is at an all-time high, this is the time for the implementation of various different reform structures. And what can be the reforms which can be brought forward? That is something that we have discussed. Now, before moving on into the second article, a reminder about the Unacademy Civil Services Championship test. Now, this is a test which will be conducted on 7th of April. You have two timings at which it will be conducted, at 11 a.m. and at 5 p.m. Do attend this test, because other than obviously the lucrative prizes such as the MacBook, laptops, phones, etc., which you can bag out of it, you will get an overall idea of your performance and you can compare it at the national level. And the questions are very representative of the prelims examination, which have been curated by the top educators. So always advisable to appear for the test on 7th of April and avail the prizes on offer. Now coming to the second article. The second article, this is something that we will join with another article which has also appeared in the editorial section. That is, the Gaza war needs a smart exit strategy. Now, and the article that we will co-join it with is the new law in terms of the US policy towards Israel. So both of them, they talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, ever since the October 7, 2023 event or militant attack which happened on Israel, Israel launched a punitive and a kind of a revenge attack on Palestine and the region of Gaza. Now, it will be almost 6 months since the war has broken. Now, in this duration of 6 months, there have been close to around 32,000 casualties, civilian casualties in the region of Gaza. The entire region of Gaza appears to be now a flattened strip, appears to be a place which is largely unknown and might very well have been one of the test centers for the arms and ammunitions that the Western world has developed. So the entire region has been pummeled to the ground. But still, there is no end in sight that where or when will this war end. Because when you initiate a war, launching a war is always easy. But when is it that you say that this is the end? That this is when we call ceasefire. For that, both the parties have to be satisfied. For example, the Hamas group, they also need to be satisfied that, okay, our objectives are also met. The Israel Defense Forces, they also need to be very satisfied that our objectives are met. Only then will they call the ceasefire. Now, in most of the cases you will see, and in almost all the modern warfares, be it the US attack on Afghanistan or the US invasion of Iraq, in both these cases you saw when US basically came into Afghanistan in 2001, the idea and the perception was that US would be done and dusted with the region within, let's suppose, 2 to 3 months. But the US troops withdrew from Afghanistan when? In 2021. Almost 20 years, and even after that, a very messy exit to say the least. The Iraq war also met with a kind of a same outcome where you did not have a clear exit. And in fact, the Iraq war, you can argue, eventually led to the ISIS situation and the ISIS problem flaring up in the region of Levant. Now, in much more recent memory, when you talk about the Russian war on Ukraine, now, when Russia invaded Ukraine almost 2 years back, again the larger understanding was that the entire thing would be done within 1 month. It has been more than 2 years. But there has not been a point where the Russian forces can declare victory and they can put an end to the war. So what is that point from where we can take a look at the end of that war? That is something which needs to be understood. And that is what the article talks about, that it needs a smart exit strategy for both the Hamas militants as well as for the Israeli Defense Forces. And this entire thought process has further been exaggerated since March 25, the UN Security Council resolution, which called for immediate ceasefire. Now, immediate ceasefire owing to the humanitarian crisis which is erupting and emerging in Gaza. That is why this ceasefire was called upon. But then, here, previous various different motions were also introduced into the UN Security Council, but almost all of them were vetoed by the United States. The United States being a very staunch supporter of the Israeli policy ever since almost half a century back. Various different US presidents, as soon as they get elected, they basically make public their Israeli policy, which is about a kind of a unilateral support in terms of arms, ammunitions, funding, etc. Now, it was this time when the US did not push its veto. As the US did not push its veto, this resolution calling for ceasefire was passed. Now, this was the first resolution in this span of 6 months which called for ceasefire. Now, initially, the Hamas militants, they accepted it. But when they saw the reaction from the Israeli side, they were very angered by it. Angered not only by the resolution, but also by the fact that US has not put the veto on that resolution. So the Israeli political leadership, including Benjamin Netanyahu, they made public statements regarding how this has been a departure from the US policy measures and the US policy norms. All of them, they made that public statement. In fact, the delegation of Israeli legislators who were set to visit US, even that was cancelled owing to this particular resolution. So clearly, Israel is not in a position or not in a mood to compromise or withdraw from this conflict. Now, that puts the entire ceasefire plan back to the dustbin and again puts the countries back to square one. Where do you go from here? Now, again, the onus is on countries such as Egypt and Qatar in order to bring forward and hammer out a negotiation, which they have been doing in the back room for some time now, bringing various parties on the table. Now, when you launch a war, you have an objective. For example, Whenever you have had India-Pakistan war, most of these wars, all these wars were initiated and instigated by Pakistan. They had a clear-cut objective. For example, we'll cut this highway, we will dismember this particular state, we will foment internal disturbance, etc. Once you achieve that objective, you call an end to it. Now, when Israel launched this war, it had three different objectives. The three objectives that it aimed to achieve. Now, what were the objectives? The first objective was to flatten the entire region of Gaza, so that from there, in future, no such attack can be launched on Israel ever again. Now, that has been largely achieved. The entire region of Gaza has almost been flattened. Then, also to neutralize the Hamas militants. So, the first was to flatten Gaza as a revenge of what happened on 7th of October. Now, whether that is justified or not justified, we are not getting into that argument. But what was the objective of the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF? Then, to neutralize the Hamas militants. Now, the Hamas militants, around 30% of them have been neutralized. But it is not an army that you are fighting. These are militants, these are militias. They always will have that mobility to disperse from one region to another. That is where the military commanders of Hamas, they are still at large, and the Israeli Defense Forces are nowhere close to killing them. And also understand, for every civilian that is killed, every young child that is killed, there will be many more number of militants who shall pick up arms, many more members of the civil society who might be forced to pick up arms. So, in a way, what Israel is doing is, it is further fueling the rise of these militants by this action. And then, the third objective was hostage rescue. Now, this also has met with very partial success. In fact, the various reports have indicated that more than 30 of the hostages, they have been killed in the crossfire between the IDF and the Hamas forces. So, while Gaza stands flattened, while the civilian casualties are increasing, the objectives are not being met. And that is why there are fresh escalations which are happening. For example, the Hamas militants, they have launched an attack into the northern military bases around the northern portion of Israel. And that also has led to significant number of casualties in the region. Israel, on its part, has launched an attack into Lebanon, and recently a completely unprovoked attack, so to say, into Syria, where it attacked the Iranian embassy. Now, that has brought and dragged Iran directly into the conflict. And Iran has also basically gave a statement that this will be met with an appropriate response. That means Iran is further going to jump into the conflict with all guns blazing. So this conflict, rather than stopping, is flaring up. And this has happened previously also. Whenever the conflict in Israel and in the surrounding regions have happened, this has happened previously also. But in the previous scenarios, the case which was presented, which is highlighted in this article, is the fact that the US, which is the largest supporter of the Israeli policies, where the US basically turns a blind eye even in terms of human rights violations done by Israel and so on. Now, it is the US which would pull the strings. But under the Joe Biden administration, even that is not happening. While the administration is busy commenting on certain things and electoral processes in India, they are not, or they are turning a blind eye rather into the events which are happening in the region of Israel and Palestine. Now, the previous US presidents, be it Eisenhower, be it even Ronald Reagan, all of them, they have urged Israel and they have previously stopped the funding and delivery of arms and ammunition to Israel to bring Israel to line. Now, in US, you would largely be aware that you have the two major dominant parties, that is the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans are always considered to be the staunch supporter of the Israeli cause. And they have always whenever a Republican president has been in power, they have put in huge amount of sums for the Israeli Defense Forces. The Democrats, on the other hand, they are a bit more left-leaning. And the Democrats, they basically pull the strings back when it comes to handing out grants and revenue or money to Israel. Joe Biden, being a Democrat president, still is turning a blind eye. And that reflects very poorly on the US policies. In fact, as soon as this furor emerged in Israel after this veto or this resolution of ceasefire was passed in the UN, there was a lot of furor in the entirety of the region of the Israeli political class. There was a lot of aggravation which was there. Now, immediately after that, US came up with a statement that, look, Israel is not bound to follow this resolution. Israel can do whatever it wants. Now, what does it do? It brings hypocrisy of US, which calls itself as the leader of the free world, up to the front. And at the same time, it basically dilutes the role of international agencies and the international organizations such as the UN Security Council. Now, its role, its power, its jurisdiction, all of that is virtually diluted. If today US is saying that regardless of the resolution passed by the Security Council, Israel can do whatever it wants, what is to stop countries such as China or countries such as Russia from continuing their aggression that they are? At that point of time, you cannot cite the UN security resolutions, can you? So what this is doing, the US policy in particular is doing, not only from one hand, it is fueling that particular conflict further being raised upon, but simultaneously, it is impacting the global peace and order. Now, what is the way out? The way out, now that Israel has flattened the portion of Gaza, the purpose of Israel doing that is to maintain a buffer zone where it can monitor any kind of movement so that future attacks cannot be launched from there. So that is one purpose and one way out. So Israel has achieved that. Secondly, Israel can also bring forward humanitarian aid to the civilian population. Because if you alienate the civilian population, you are further exaggerating the issue. And once the situation has calmed down, at that point of time, both the parties need to go back to the drawing board, and both the parties need to think seriously about the two-state solution. That the people of the region in both the states, they have the right to coexist and co-live. So that is the final thing that they have to work upon. Now, you cannot change your neighbors, can you? You cannot change the ethnicity, can you? So coexistence and co-living, that needs to be worked upon, because the impact of this conflict has widened much beyond this particular region. The trade, particularly in that very vital area of Red Sea, the British forces and the British merchant vessels, the French merchant vessels, the US merchant vessels, all of them are being targeted in this narrow area between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden around the region of Bab al-Mandeb. As a consequence of this particular narrow stretch and as a consequence of the conflict going here, you have frequent drone attacks, missile attacks by the Houthi militants, and also taking advantage of this situation, you have the Somali pirates who have risen up again. Now, what this has done, many of the ships are avoiding this route altogether. Now, avoidance of these shipping routes has meant a loss of revenue for countries such as Eritrea and Djibouti, which rely on these shipping lanes. And secondly, the insurance cost for these container vessels have shot up almost exponentially, which also basically means that as the logistic cost, the transportation cost is increasing, the price of goods that you and I buy, those prices are jacking up. Now, that is not good in the scenario where multiple countries have entered into a phase of recession. In that scenario, that escalatory prices are never good for the global trade. So, Israel, when you take a look at the Israeli own economic and the domestic economy as well, The Israeli economy is also shrinking at a rate of around 20%. So Israel cannot withstand this war without the US aid continuing. So this war needs to be brought to an end. Otherwise, there is no such resolution in sight. Okay? Now, then after that, coming to the fourth article rather, that is poll campaigns in India must reflect climate issues. Now, this is again an article which has appeared in the editorial page and the editorial section of the newspaper. Now, this article talks about the fact that the recently released report by World Meteorological Organization, that is the State of Global Climate Report. That State of Global Climate Report, again, a report released by World Meteorological Organization, has highlighted that the years passing by are getting hotter and hotter. And already we are staring at a temperature rise of close to around 1.5 degrees Celsius as compared to the pre-industrial revolution era. Now think about it. The Paris Agreement and all the climate agreements that the world has arrived at, they talk about limiting the amount of heating to around 1.5 degrees Celsius as compared to the pre-industrial era. We have already reached that figure. The oceans are warming at an unprecedented level. The Arctic sea ice is being lost at an unprecedented level, impacting the amount of rainfall even in India. The region around Antarctica, there also the ice loss has been exponential, and again something which has not been witnessed earlier. The warming of oceans has given rise to frequent occurrences of El Nino events. The warming of the Pacific creates that El Nino, and that El Nino means reduced rainfall in countries like India and other portions of Asia. Now, already because of this and all these various climatic vagaries, countries are suffering the wrath of climate change. Agricultural crop failures, etc., lack of enough water supply, that is something which is quite common. Various different, when we talk about even energy security, energy generated from hydroelectric sector, for example, in India has indicated a very sharp decline. Almost more than 30%. Why? Because the reservoirs, they don't have enough water. If the reservoirs don't have enough, why don't the reservoirs have enough water? Because the rainfall is very, very less. The amount of rainfall which should happen is not happening. Regions such as Karnataka, etc., they are already reeling in drought. So, in the light of all these, climate change is no longer a theoretical issue. And this article argues that in order to maintain the policy momentum and action against climate change, one has to go for mainstreaming the discussion of climate change. What do we mean by mainstreaming? So as long as this entire discussion for climate change is reduced to the academia, that is the scientists themselves are discussing and talking about the evidences of it, the progress will be very, very limited. But when you have the common people talking about it, when you will have a scenario where the common masses, they converse about the reality of climate change, only then will there be a real difference in terms of what is the government policy and what is the government doing. So here, this article advocates the reality that in order to mainstream that discussion, given that electoral season is on across the world, in US, in India, in various different countries of the world, election process is initiating and has been initiated, which has given rise to a lot of enthusiasm and fervor from the side of the larger public. It is this time where the leaders need to communicate to the people about this aspect of climate change and what they can do when in power in order to get rid or tackle this issue. So that is what this article talks about. Now here, it has highlighted that successive Indian governments, they have brought in various different schemes on their own in order to basically combat climate change. One such particular scheme was the National Action Plan on Climate Change, a comprehensive mission. Under that, you had 8 submissions. So these 8 submissions, for them, various different schemes have been brought into the place. So National Solar Mission, So in order to improve the solar power utility and outtake in the residential power sector, in the industrial sector, you have various different schemes for rooftop solar, etc., which are being planned. National mission for enhanced energy efficiency, sustainable habitat, water mission, like that, sustainable Himalayan ecosystem, green agriculture, like that. You have various different submissions under the National Action Plan on Climate Change. So all these particular missions, under them, they need to be further highlighted. So National Action Plan for Climate Change. Under this, you have the various different government schemes. For example, even organic farming or the Paramparagat Krishi Vikas Yojana, that is also a part of green agriculture, sustainable agriculture. So these government schemes, they need to be highlighted. Once you do that in the election campaign process, so where do you highlight them? In the campaigns. What will that achieve? It will basically increase or raise the awareness. Raises awareness amongst the public. Makes the people aware that this is the danger that we are confronted with. And secondly, what it will also do, it will hold the government accountable for climate actions. Presently, in almost all the developing countries of the world, you will find that the governments, whatever they might do in terms of lip service, that we will do this for climate action, we are doing this for climate change, but they are never held accountable that, okay, you did not implement the solar mission. You did not bring forward a greener or sustainable condition in agriculture. So for that, they are not held accountable. So that is what it will bring about. Accountability in public policy. In climate action. So for that, one needs to highlight these issues, and no better platform than the election campaigneering exercise. But the reality and the pragmatism of it is something else. In an election campaign, in an election rally, when you have lakhs of people thronging to see their leader in the election rally, and if the leader starts talking about climate change, sustainable Himalayan ecosystem, let's suppose in some other area, that is when automatically there can be a disconnect. So for that, this raising of awareness needs to be done. If you start mainstreaming the process now, maybe by 2029 election, you might have this as a major agenda. You cannot have the sense that on 3rd of April, I pick up this issue of climate change and people will vote for me on 19th of April based upon this issue. That is not the most predominant issue in people's minds. One needs to communicate as a leader, one needs to communicate to the audience, to the public, that how, for example, their livelihood issues, their jobs, everything is getting impacted. The agricultural income is impacted by climate change. So once you take that discussion in that direction, then you will get a change maybe 4 years, 5 years down the line. Okay, one cannot expect immediate result going ahead immediately into this election. So that is the challenge which is posed. Okay, now coming to the next article, helping the hills breathe easy. Now, this is an article particularly written in the purview of the hill stations present in Tamil Nadu, that is Ooty and Kodaikanal. Ooty, which is referred to as the Queen of the Hills, and Kodaikanal, which is referred to as the Princess of the Hills. These are the celebrated hill stations which are thronged by hundreds and thousands and lakhs of tourists year after year. Now, because of this significant amount of unsustainable tourist footfall, there has been a degradation of the landscape in that area. The biodiversity is getting impacted. And that is why the Madras High Court and now the state government, they have been forced to step into this. The environmental bench of the Madras High Court, they basically have asked the state, had previously asked the state government to give them an idea about what is the number of tourist footfalls and what can they do in order to maintain the pristine nature of biodiversity in the hills and in these hill stations. So thereby, there has been an in-principle agreement which has been put forward by the Chief Secretary of the state government, and that has been submitted by the Solicitor General in the Madras High Court, that we are going to limit the number of vehicles which can go to these hills. Why? What is the reason for that? So if you take a look at the reasons why that limitation needs to be done, so there are various ecological environmental reasons associated. First of all, when you have very large number of people coming in, there is significant amount of pollution. Pollution not only in terms of air and noise pollution, but also in terms of the pollution of solid waste, plastic waste dumping, etc. Now, it has been found that the amount of plastics which are dumped in the region by the tourists, they end up in the digestive tract of the elephants in that area. What has also been found that many of the glass bottles, the liquor and the wine bottles procured from nearby, they are thrown randomly. And that cut glass has wounded many of the wildlife also. So that is where the court has basically pulled up the Tasmak also, the vendor for liquor in the region of Tamil Nadu. It has pulled it up and it has said and directed it that, look, go for the bottle buyback scheme, so that people who are buying glass bottles from you, they are incentivized to return that glass bottle to you as well. So thereby you can take care of the waste generated and the waste management. Also, the region of Ooty, Kodaikanal, for example, and even if you consider the region of Munnar nearby, but this is an article dealing with Ooty and Kodaikanal itself, but if you consider the larger Nilgiris area, because of increased amount of these vehicles, the horns, the continuous traffic jams, that noise and light pollution in these hills, that has further done the disservice of dissuading the animals away from that area. That is a significant drawback. Okay, so that is why pollution is one such factor. The other aspect is degradation of vegetation, which supports that wildlife. That vegetation is getting degraded year after year. Then after that, if you take a look at it, then when we talk about elephants, for example, so because of increased footfalls, you will have unsustainable construction, electricity lines passing by, and as a result of that, electrocution is a very common phenomena here. Man-animal conflict is on the rise. And also, you have to understand that, look, if you have 50,000 people coming into a hill station this year, so as a, let's suppose a hotel owner, I will try to open another hotel. Now, even if I don't get the required clearance, I will establish a hotel anywhere and everywhere. So due to that, the slope, the topography of that region also gets disturbed, leading to frequent landslides and causation of natural disasters. This can lead to disasters also. Now recently, you had a very significantly landmark judgment which was backed by the NGT, the National Green Tribunal as well, where the number of vehicles plying between the region of Manali and Rohtang Pass in Himachal Pradesh, that was sought to be restricted, so that these issues, they don't come to the forefront and the critical habitat of Himalayan ecosystem, that is secured. So this particular ruling by the Madras High Court and the agreement by the state government, it follows a similar line, where once you limit that and then you promote sustainable ecotourism, that is when even the region's pristinity can be conserved, its exclusivity can be maintained, and at the same time, you can have responsible tourism which can be generated. So that is the concept brought forward by this particular article. Now, coming to the next article. Will India experience more heat wave days this particular summer. Now, regardless of whichever part of the country you are living in, northwestern, central, eastern, southern, all of you would be experiencing a very scorching condition of heat. Heat which is becoming unbearable. The news from the side of the Indian Meteorological Department is that it is going to get much worse in the next couple of weeks and in the next couple of months. The amount of rainfall in our country is going to further reduce, and we will have further number of dry days, due to which there is an increased possibility of heat waves becoming a reality. Now, what is a heat wave? The name in itself is quite self-explanatory for that matter, but when you talk about or when you hear the term heat wave, what is the meaning of this? When is it that a heat wave is declared? Obviously, extraordinarily hotter conditions, that is when a heat wave can be declared. So, heat wave is declared in two conditions or in few conditions. For example, in the plains, if the temperature is consistently greater than 40 degrees Celsius and there is a departure from normal temperatures by 4.5 degrees Celsius to 6.4 degrees Celsius. That is, if let's suppose that the normal ideal temperature that should be experienced, let's suppose in Hyderabad. In Hyderabad, if the normal temperature in any particular day which has to be expected is 34, but that region is experiencing 40 degree. Now, it is a departure of more than 6 degrees and the temperature in the plain has exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, a heat wave can be declared. Let's suppose the normal temperature in Delhi for the month of April or for 3rd of April, the normal temperature has to be 30 degrees Celsius. It is experiencing 35 degrees Celsius and more, still heat wave won't be declared. For the plain region, that has to cross 40 degrees Celsius. For the hilly areas, for the hills, if the temperature is greater than 30 degrees Celsius and this condition needs to be fulfilled. That in the hilly areas, if the temperature is more than 30 degrees Celsius and if there is a departure from the normal minimum and maximum temperature by 4.5 to 6.4 degrees Celsius, a heat wave is declared. Other than that, let's suppose the absolute temperature is greater than 45 degrees Celsius. Even then, a heat wave is declared. In general situations also, if the conditions of scorching heat, they lead to casualties, death of people, then also in certain cases heat wave can be declared. Now, these heat waves, they are a reality in almost all the parts of the country. Now, what is the reason for this? So, when we talk about the reasons why India will experience more number of heat wave days in 2024, the reasons are quite simple. We have been receiving very little amount of rainfall for the past year. In fact, 2023 was the year of El Nino. El Nino means the warming phase of the Pacific. As the Pacific would warm up, the region of India and the region of Asia in general receives lesser amount of rainfall. So, we received lesser amount of rainfall. Even though this El Nino has been weakening ever since the onset of the new year, but still that El Nino condition is present. So, that means in our country, we have a condition of less rains. Now, less rains, why will that lead to heat wave? Less rains means less moisture availability in the ground, for example, in the soil, for example. Now, in general and in normal conditions, if let's suppose this is the ground surface, it has got some amount of moisture. When the heating is very high, this moisture is lost as a result of evaporation. that is lost by evaporation. And whenever evaporation occurs, evaporation either from the body surface or any particular region, evaporation also and always brings about an associated cooling effect. But here, as this evaporation does not occur. Why? Because the rainfall has been very less. So the ground also doesn't have moisture. The water bodies, they don't have moisture and water available. That is why the reservoirs don't have water. Right? That is why the hydroelectric energy which is generated is very less. So these heat wave conditions, they are much more exaggerated. And generally, in these months of April, you already have pre-monsoon showers, convective thunderstorms developing in the region of Karnataka, Kerala, West Bengal, and also in the region of Assam. But this year, due to the El Niño conditions, even this has not happened. So whatever moderation in temperature was expected, that moderation is also not happening. It is not on the cards. And hence, water scarcity and these heat waves are prominent. What will be the impact of this? The heat wave conditions are increasing. What will be the impact? First impact will be on the human health. Human health. Every year, we lose hundreds of people due to the scorching heat wave conditions. So that will be a direct impact. The second impact will be on agricultural losses. Regions such as Karnataka, etc., they have already been experiencing drought-like conditions in many of the areas, suffering from almost intolerable crop and vegetable losses. So that will have a long-term ramification in the economic structure. Then, increase in the spread of diseases. Increased diseases. And we are on the verge of the biggest electoral exercise or the biggest festival of democracy, that is the general elections being held, and this is the largest election anywhere else in the world. So that is why in this forefront and in this scenario, managing that amount of heat wave is paramount. And managing the amount of these issues or the human casualties which can occur otherwise, that needs to be very important. So what can be done? Clean drinking water needs to be supplied by the municipalities. You need to have a standard operating procedure mentioned for the various hospitals and the primary healthcare centers. Availability of electrolyte solutions, ORS solutions, etc. needs to be provided to the grassroots level. Development of shade and those cooler areas need to be provided on the larger scale in the city and the villages. And also, frequent monitoring of the pedestrian population needs to be done by the city administration to ensure there is no victim who is basically falling the prey to excess amount of heat. Okay? It is these events which bring to light the fact that climate change is no longer a theoretical question, it is upon us. Now, then, amid friction, India-US plan high-level visits this month. Now, for anybody who is basically not hidden behind a rock and anybody who is listening to news headlines for the past month or so, it wouldn't be new to you that India and US, when it comes to at least what they are issuing as statements in the public, they are not in the best of each other's accounts as of the moment. You had a few days back an interview given in ANI on the Smita Prakash podcast by Eric Garcetti, the US ambassador to India, where he basically again on the issue of the Khalistan issue and also on the issue of Gurpatwant Singh Pannu, he basically highlighted the red line for the various governments. Now, the question was then put forward and put back to Dr. S. Jaishankar, who replied that, look, that red line, what he is talking about, he is towing his own government's line, and basically for us, that issue is much more sensitive and US is not realizing that. Even prior to that, as soon as you had the arrests made for the Delhi Chief Minister, the US State Department issued a statement. Now, whenever a statement is issued, now Germany had also issued a statement. India takes this very seriously. It is a direct meddling in your internal democratic structure that a particular country is doing. For example, if Donald Trump is being put on trial, you don't have the spokesperson of MEA basically talking about the US judicial process, do we? So that is where India took it very seriously. And India rebutted that statement. But the next day, the State Department, it compounded on its earlier statements, and it said that, look, the IT action against the Congress bank accounts, that is also something that the State Department is looking at. Now, this doesn't put the two sides in the most amicable of the scenario. That is exaggerating the level of conflict, at least on the surface. But then, what this article highlights is the fact that the Indo-US cooperation, when it comes to the substances, that is something which is being carried on and which has been picking up pace. Now, you will have a visit to the US by the Indian Foreign Secretary, and it is also expected that the National Security Advisor of US, Jake Sullivan, he is slated to visit India. He was ideally supposed to visit India a couple of months back itself and also issue a statement and an address in the Raisina dialogue. But then, due to the Israel-Palestine conflict, that visit could not happen. Now, these national security advisors on both sides, they will meet. And thereby, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, ICET, that is going to be discussed furthermore. Now, this is where substantive progress has been happening in the Indo-US relationship. Both India and United States, they identify each other as the strategic partners of this 21st century. And regardless of the ripples on the surface, when you take a look at the scientific community, when you take a look at the policy coordination, it is marching forward. And ICET is an evidence in that regard. So what is that ICET? ICET, which is operationally run by the National Security Advisor offices in both these countries. It was announced by India and the US in May 2022 and officially launched last year in Jan 2023. Now, under this initiative, both the countries, they have basically identified areas of emerging and critical technology for cooperation, co-development, as well as co-production. Areas such as artificial intelligence, wireless communication. These are the areas, quantum computing, semiconductors, chip manufacturing. All of these have been identified as the key areas for cooperation. Now, this ICET, it stands on 6 various different pillars. It is in these areas where cooperation and coordination is being sought. For example, AI Research Agency Partnership for increased utility and applicability of AI in our day-to-day lives. Then, defense industrial cooperation, defense technological cooperation and defense startups. It is in the light of this that both India and US, they have initiated IndusX, which is to realize and which is for the development of new tech, newer technology in the defense sector. Because both of them, and India more so, has realized that, look, we cannot always be a buyer or a purchaser of US technology. That US has developed this technology in the 70s, India will buy it in the 90s or the 2000s. That means we will always have a lag. That is where the defense startups in both the countries, they are going to coordinate under this IndusX, and they are going to develop, co-develop and partner in newer technologies of stealth, of communication, wireless communication, and so on. innovative ecosystem, semiconductor ecosystem development, cooperation on human space flight. That is also something which is being worked forward, both for the aspect of the Atlantis missions as well as the satellite launches with each other's vessels and vehicles, advancement in 5G and 6G technologies. So these are the areas of cooperation under ICET. Now, one of the tangible benefits to come out of it is the cooperation in terms of engine manufacturing, where India has basically, you have HAL partnering with GE in order to manufacture the modern engines which can be used for the jets, the fighter jets. So these are the areas of cooperation which needs to be worked upon, which needs to be further explored, so that the differences which appear time to time on the table, that differences are warded off. Now, the community, the industrial community in US basically is saying that, look, whatever comments that the US government has been making recently, that is largely by the far left of the Democrats. It is a bipartisan support, that is both Democrats and Republicans, they support India when it comes to the policy measures. So that is where there will be advancement, there will be movement forward. But we need to capitalize on these particular gains for the upliftment of the larger population out of their conditions. Okay? So here ICET is something that can be relevant even for your prelims. Okay, so this will be facilitated by the visit of Jake Sullivan into India. Now, then coming to a couple of articles relevant for your prelims. India risking demographic dividend. Now, as per a report which has been brought forward by World Bank, India and other countries in South Asia, they are not generating jobs at the same level as the rate of increase in population. So before coming to it, what is the meaning of demographic dividend? Demography. Demography refers to the qualitative aspect of the population. Now, in a country like India, where you have almost 60% of the population below the age of 35 years, means every year you have millions of people coming into the job arena and into the job sector. Now, whenever any country has gone through this particular phase, it is in that particular stage where the country grows economically to such a level that it sustains that particular country's growth and economy for many, many decades going ahead into the future. So that is the demographic dividend, the benefit that you have got out of the qualitative aspect of your population. If your population had been old, you might not have had that much amount of economic output. But a younger and a youthful population means you can have a substantial amount of economic output. So that is something that India has to utilize. India will have that demographic dividend up till the 2040s. After that, the population of India will start growing older and older. So in this particular phase, we need to generate as many different kind of jobs as we can, as many number of jobs as we can. Now, while India still is a kind of a beacon of hope in the global economic doom scenario that we have, we are still the fastest growing large economy in the world. But as per this World Bank report, we are still not generating enough number of jobs. And if that is a trend up till 2022. The 2023 data indicates that there has been a slight uptick in the terms of number of jobs which have been generated, but still not nearly enough. And you have a similar case in the region of Pakistan also, Bangladesh also, Nepal also, Sri Lanka also, which highlights that the entirety of South Asia, it is squandering away its demographic dividend. And that is a situation which lies upon us also. If that dividend is not utilized, you have increased joblessness, which is on the anvil. More people will be unemployed. That gives rise to strife and agitation in the society. Violence and crime rises up. And then a society can be plunged into frequent types of social, internal dissuasions and disorders. That is what is referred to as a demographic disaster. So if you don't generate enough jobs when your demography is favorable, that can always end up leading to a demographic disaster. So in order to prevent that demographic disaster, what is it that a country like India needs to do? Upskill the people, generate enough number of quality jobs, and so that when you have a reasonable amount of income, you can be productive to the economy as well. Okay? Now, coming to the last article. March manufacturing PMI survey signals a 16-year peak. Now, the manufacturing PMI survey, which is conducted every month in the form of a survey, a set of questions which are asked to the industry people, and based upon that particular question and its answer, you gauge an overall sentiment about whether the economy is expanding, whether the sector of the economy is contracting. So basically, this PMI figure for the month of March has indicated a number of 59.1, which is a record high. Now, this is an index which is generated from 0 to 100. Now, a number of 50 means no change. A number less than 50 means it is contracting. The economy is contracting, or the sector is contracting. A number greater than 50 indicates expansion. So a number as high as 59 indicates a significant expansion. And this is a trend which is not very alien. If you observe this particular trend, ever since the time of January 2023, the PMI numbers have always indicated an uptick. So that is quite beneficial. Now, this is largely on the back of increased robust domestic economic demand and increase in the export orders also. So here what you see is basically a series of various different questions on which the responses are measured, and accordingly an index is provided. So here basically it is the PMI is based on the 5 survey areas: new orders, export market comes into that, inventory levels, the existing supply materials that you have, production, supplier deliveries, and employment. Now, the present day PMI numbers have indicated that there is an increase in the new orders. After 2 months, there has been an increase in the employment also. The manufacturers are seeking to hire more people also. And there is a pent-up demand in the economy also. That bodes well going ahead into the future, and that indicates that the economy is going to expand. Now, for your examination, do you need to learn this data 59.1? Absolutely not. You need to have an idea about the trend. So the PMI has indicated an expansion since January 2023. The statement is correct or incorrect? That kind of question. So here the statement is correct because PMI has always been more than 50 in this case. Okay. Now that PMI is based upon which particular set of queries or which particular areas. So that becomes relevant for your prelims. These are the things that you have to extract for prelims. Okay. Now let us take a look at the couple of questions on which I advise you to write answers on your own. So discuss the need to limit the number of tourist footfalls in order to maintain ecological balance of the hills and the mountains. Now here in this particular question, when you write the answer, the intro has to talk about the problem that the question is talking about. And how do you initiate that intro? Unsustainable level of tourism and construction activities initiated thereby have put at risk the ecological survivability and the natural survivability of majority of the hill stations, be it in the southern part of the Western Ghats or in the critical landscape of the Himalayas. Thereby, with this introduction, you have highlighted it to the examiner that you know what the problem is that the question is talking about. Then after that, talk about the problems in the body. Initially, already you have set a context. Start the body by talking about that the unsustainable tourist numbers, they bring forward various certain issues. You can write as sub-points, as sub-paragraphs also about increased pollution, solid waste dumping, glass bottles, noise, light pollution, fragmentation of habitat, and also electrocution, destruction of natural vegetation. All these you can highlight. Now, then always advisable that put forward a way forward or what to do. So all these issues, not only do they risk the region, but also the critical biodiversity. In order to bring this under control, the various different high courts and the NGT, through its various orders, have issued a set of guidelines. Always advisable that by this point of time, because it is a 10-mark question, you won't have that much space. So use the bubbles or use basically the kind of graphical representation such as solution, and thereby provide the solutions in terms of the blocks. Okay? What this will do is it will increase the visibility, limit the space, hasten up your answer writing, and improve the presentation marks that you attain. So solution, limit the number of footfalls, maintain ecotourism, ensure collect back and buy back schemes, greater implementation of EPR regime. All these you can highlight. Okay? Now, can climate issue become a part of the electoral process? Analyze the statement by highlighting the pros and the challenges. So, climate issue is one of the most pertinent issue going ahead into the modern era, which is going to define all our lives. Write about that. Talk about it. For example, what are the pros of bringing the climate issue at the forefront, raising awareness, bringing accountability, greater visibility of the climate actions. A tangible change is something which will be very apparent. All these you can highlight. However, there are certain challenges which still confront us on bringing this in election campaigning. And what are the challenges? Lack of enough traction, lack of awareness amongst people, a voter to policymaker disconnect. All these you can talk about. Eventually, you have to talk about the relevance of mainstreaming these issues so that there is a larger movement towards actions against climate change. And together, the governments and the public at large can work towards making the world a better place. So like that, you can conclude. Try writing this on your own and get it evaluated. That will be an ideal analysis of whatever you have understood. So that marks the end of the session. If you have liked the content, please don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again tomorrow, take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.